Chapter 1. The First Glimpse. It was a quiet October afternoon when Anna's life began to unravel. She had just bought a new camera, a sleek, top-of-the-line model that promised to take her photography hobby to the next level. Excited, she packed her bag and headed to the park, eager to test it out. The autumn sun hung low, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. The trees were ablaze with red and orange, their leaves fluttering gently in the breeze. It was the perfect day for photography. Anna wandered through the park for hours, snapping pictures of anything that caught her eye. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees, a lone squirrel nibbling on a nut, a couple walking hand-in-hand down a leaf-covered path. The park was nearly empty, and the solitude was soothing. As the sun began to set, she took one final shot, a simple photo of a wooden bench near the edge of the pond, surrounded by the soft colors of autumn. That night, Anna sat down to review her work. As she flipped through the photos, she felt a wave of satisfaction. The new camera had done wonders for her shots. The colors were rich, the details crisp. But then she stopped. In the background of the photo of the bench, just barely visible, was a figure. A person standing a few meters behind the bench, partially hidden by the trees. Anna frowned. She didn't remember anyone being there when she took the photo. Zooming in, her heart skipped a beat. The figure was odd, blurry, and most disturbingly faceless. The head was smooth, like a mannequin, without any features. No eyes, no mouth, no nose. Just a blank, skin-like surface. Her first thought was that it must be some kind of camera glitch. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a smudge on the lens. Shrugging it off, she moved on to the next photo. But when she saw the same faceless figure in another shot, this time standing a little closer, her stomach twisted. It was impossible. She was sure she had been alone in the park. She'd been careful to avoid people in her shots. And yet there it was again, this time closer than before. Anna closed her laptop, trying to shake the unease creeping over her. It was probably nothing, she told herself. Some random passerby she hadn't noticed. Tomorrow she'd go back to the park, maybe reshoot some of the scenes. But as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't shake the image of the faceless figure. It haunted her thoughts, lingering in the back of her mind like a shadow. Chapter 2. The Figure Returns. Days passed, and the unease faded slightly. Anna returned to her usual photography routine, though she avoided going back to the park. Instead, she focused on urban shots, trying to capture the beauty of everyday life in the bustling city streets. But as she began editing her latest batch of photos, her blood ran cold. The faceless figure was there again. In one of the shots she had taken of a crowded cafe, the figure stood outside, just beyond the window, staring in. It was farther away this time, but unmistakable. The same smooth, featureless face. The same eerie stillness. A sense of dread clawed at her insides. How could this be happening? Frantically, she clicked through the rest of the photos. Each time she saw it, the figure was closer. In one photo, it was standing just a few feet behind a group of people, though no one seemed to notice it. In another, it was half hidden in the shadow of an alleyway. But always, it was the same faceless silhouette. Anna's heart raced. She couldn't explain it, but she knew something was terribly wrong. She tried showing the photos to her friends, but no one else could see the figure. They laughed it off, teasing her about her overactive imagination. Her boyfriend, Max, told her she was just stressed from work and needed to take a break. But Anna couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Chapter 3. The Camera's Curse. The photos haunted her. Everywhere she went, no matter what she shot, the faceless man appeared. He was always in the background, sometimes barely visible, other times closer. His presence began to consume her thoughts, filling her with dread. Every time she pressed the shutter, her heart pounded in anticipation, terrified of where he would show up next. Anna's sleep was plagued by nightmares. She dreamed of dark places, empty streets, and the faceless man, standing at the edge of her vision, always just out of reach. Sometimes he moved closer, his blank face almost touching hers before she would wake up gasping for air. One night, in a fit of desperation, Anna tried smashing the camera. She took a hammer to it, shattering the lens and destroying the body, hoping that would end the nightmare. But the next morning, when she turned on her phone, she found a new photo in her gallery, one she hadn't taken. It was a picture of her bedroom, dark and empty, except for the faceless man standing by her window. That was when Anna realized it wasn't the camera. It was something else, something much worse. Chapter 4. The Man in the Mirror. Anna began avoiding mirrors. She started noticing him not just in her photos, but in reflections. It started with small glimpses, a flash of movement in a shop window, a shadow in the corner of a mirror. Each time she turned around, there was nothing there, but she knew. She could feel his presence, growing stronger, closer. Her apartment, once her sanctuary, became a prison. She covered the mirrors, kept the lights on at all times, and refused to look out the windows. But it was no use. He was everywhere. One evening, as she was brushing her teeth, she caught sight of him in the bathroom mirror. He stood right behind her, his faceless head tilted slightly, as though watching her. Anna froze, paralyzed with fear. Slowly, she turned around, expecting to see him standing there in the flesh. But the room was empty. Her reflection, though, told a different story. He was still there in the mirror, closer now, his hand reaching out toward her reflection's shoulder. Anna screamed and ran from the bathroom, slamming the door behind her. She knew she couldn't escape him. He was part of her now. Chapter 5. The Descent into Madness. The next few weeks were a blur of terror and paranoia. Anna stopped leaving her apartment altogether, afraid that the faceless man would follow her out into the world. Her friends grew concerned, but she refused to let anyone visit. She couldn't bear the thought of them seeing him, or worse, him seeing them. Her sleep, once fitful, became almost non-existent. Every night, she would wake up in a cold sweat, feeling the weight of his presence pressing down on her chest. Sometimes she swore she could hear him breathing, feel his cold touch on her skin. But when she opened her eyes, the room would be empty. She stopped taking photos altogether, but it didn't matter. The faceless man no longer needed the camera to appear. He was always there, lurking in the shadows, watching her from the corners of her vision. Her once orderly apartment became a chaotic mess. Clothes strewn across the floor, dishes piled in the sink, curtains drawn tight to keep out any light. Anna's world had shrunk to the size of her tiny living room, where she huddled on the couch, too scared to move. Chapter 6. The Search for Answers. Desperate for answers, Anna turned to the internet. She scoured forums and message boards, trying to find any mention of what she was experiencing. One night, deep in an obscure photography forum, she found a post that made her blood run cold. The post was old, written years ago by someone claiming to have experienced something similar. They described taking photos and seeing a faceless figure in the background, just like Anna. As the figure grew closer in their photos, strange things began to happen. Nightmares, reflections that didn't match reality, a sense of being watched. The post ended abruptly, with no explanation of what happened to the person. Anna's hands shook as she read the final sentence. If you see him in your dreams, it's already too late. She tried to contact the person who wrote the post, but their account had been inactive for years. No one else on the forum seemed to have experienced anything like it. Anna was on her own. Chapter 7. The Final Confrontation. It was a cold, stormy night when Anna finally reached her breaking point. The faceless man had grown bolder. He no longer waited for her to look at photos or mirrors. He stood at the foot of her bed, in the corners of her living room, by the window in her kitchen. Always watching, always waiting. She knew she couldn't outrun him. There was only one thing left to do. Anna stood in front of her bathroom mirror, clutching her phone in trembling hands. She had to confront him. She had to know why he had chosen her, why he wouldn't leave her alone. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The reflection in the mirror warped and twisted. Slowly, the faceless man appeared, standing directly behind her. His hand reached out, touching her reflection's shoulder, just as it had before. Anna felt a cold, heavy presence settle over her, suffocating her. With a trembling hand, she raised her phone and took a photo of the mirror. The flash lit up the room for a split second, and then everything went dark. Chapter 8. The Vanishing. When the light faded, the faceless man was gone. The apartment was silent. Anna blinked, her heart pounding in her chest. Had she finally done it? Had she freed herself from the nightmare? She glanced down at her phone, her breath catching in her throat. There, on the screen, was the last photo she had taken. It showed the mirror, empty except for the faceless man standing directly in front of her. But this time, his arm was fully extended, his hand touching her reflection's face. The blank, featureless face was so close now, almost merging with hers. Anna's vision blurred, her head spinning. The room around her seemed to stretch and distort, the walls closing in on her. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her body felt heavy, her limbs unresponsive. She was being pulled toward the mirror, her reflection merging with his. The phone slipped from her hands, hitting the floor with a soft thud. The last thing she saw before everything went black was her own face, staring back at her from the mirror. But it wasn't her anymore. The faceless man had finally reached her. The next morning, Anna's apartment was eerily quiet. The curtains were drawn, the lights off, and the air thick with a sense of abandonment. A neighbor knocked on the door, concerned after not hearing from her for days, but there was no answer. Inside, the apartment was undisturbed, except for a single phone lying on the bathroom floor. On the screen was the last photo Anna had taken, an empty room with a faint reflection of a figure standing just outside the frame. The faceless man now waits in the mirror for someone else to look too closely.